I wish I could have someone to tell me of the actions of my head, the causing of visions to be heard in different sounds. The first excited voice was the one I knew, and the second were a strange voice. The first voice was to my right, and the second was to my left.
These were the words of John Longman, a patient at the Bristol Lunatic Asylum. Like many patients of the asylum, what differentiated him from the rest of the people of Bristol were his experiences. What made him different from the other patients was that he wrote about these experiences. This is his story. John was, like most asylum patients, quite ordinary, not rich, not poor, a country lad who came to Bristol to better himself. He was one of 13 children, born in 1840 to Emmanuel and Mary, and his early life was spent in Marnhole, a village in Dorset. According to the Marnhole Messenger, in Thomas Hardy's Tess of the d'Urbervilles, Marnhole was called Marlott and lies in the Blackmore Vale, an area of outstanding natural beauty. Here is the pub, in the book called The Pure Drop Inn, now rather tamely named The Crown. John became a stonemason, and in March 1862 he married Charlotte Rake, and their union was fruitful. Mary arrived in 1864, Bertha in 66, Laura in 67, and Ernest in 69. In about 1870 they moved, as the 1871 census shows them living together in Bristol. Yeah. Their fruitfulness continued, with Ada in 71, William in 74, and Stanley in 75. They lived at 39 Egerton Road, Horfield, and this is what their house looks like today. Thus far, a fairly ordinary life, neither rich nor poor. There were no history of mental problems in his family, and his children were healthy. He could read and write, and his religion was Methodist. From this time, we know more about John, as his life is detailed in the admission books, which are based at the Bristol Archives. In the autumn of 1876, he began to change. He became irritable, his sleep became erratic, and he found it difficult to work. He communicated less with his family, and when he did talk, it often seemed incomprehensible, with references to God and the devil. As his condition deteriorated, he stopped work completely, which must have been difficult for the family, with a wife and 6 children to feed. He arrived at the asylum at 3:10 p.m. on the 13th of December 1876. He was 36 at the time and was to spend another 36 years in the asylum until his death in 1912. On admission, he was described as very excited and told the doctor that he had seen the devil, who was driven away by 2 angels. He was very religious and saw lots of angels, and the following passage from John is fairly typical.
Natural forms excited me, and they came to me in the form of angels of the Lord and devils from hell. The first created a voice that came in whispers and said, "Poison," and it sounded like a man I knew, called Dowling, who I suspected was having arrangements with my wife.
During the first few years of his time in the asylum, John seems to have been particularly troubled. He is often described by that favourite Victorian word, excited. He talked mostly to himself, and when asked who he was talking to, he replied, "My father." His diagnosis was mania, and his symptoms were delusions and hallucinations, often of a paranoid nature. There was no medication for his symptoms, and those seen here from the Glenside Museum's collection are mostly for physical conditions. Very few patients wrote about their symptoms, but he wrote about them in several letters, including this one to his wife.
Charlotte, the Lord has seen fit that I should write a few lines to you to know how it is that you have not been visiting me since a month. Is it because of the child you brought with you, whose Dowling's? You have another one besides, that is not mine.
During another visit from his wife, he had to be removed from the visitors' room because of his foul language, and he told the staff his wife was a whoremonger. There's no way to know if there was any truth in his allegations, but they seem more likely to be symptoms of his condition. He seems to constantly misinterpret events and people's actions, and from these misinterpretations his mind devises paranoid conspiracies against him. His admission seems to have had a devastating effect on his family. His wife couldn't manage all the children, and 3 of them were looked after by friends, Charles and Ellen Bird. However, we see that by the time of the 1891 census, the family, minus John, was back together again and included grandchildren. Lastly, here is Charlotte in 1922, aged 72 and living with 3 of her adult children. Charlotte continued to live with some of her children and lived to the ripe old age of 92, dying in 1931. John wrote several letters and poems about his experiences, including some that are fairly straightforward, such as one which states,
"A supernatural voice spoke to my neighbour of arsenic, and I supposed the voice to be that of a man."
This example is more troubling and difficult to understand.
"A supernatural sound as of a rattling a box cover on books, and dropping of a rod on a bedroom floor. But supposing the sound was natural, and supposing both poisons were for me, and at the charge of the gun to shoot me, and the pistol snaps, a trial to do so."
These are clearly the thoughts of a very disturbed man. In rather poetic language, he's described a man expecting to die either from poison or shooting. It's reminiscent of a horror film, but for him it seems real and must have terrified him. He doesn't seem to have made any friends in the asylum. His delusions and hallucinations meant he literally saw people in a different light, and in a letter to a friend he wrote,
"I'm staying with a company of men that speak and dance like devils.
His drawings were not kept, except for this small example, which was pasted into his notes. The note for the 6th of February, 1880, records that he sees visions of angels, devils, etc., and these are the images he draws. On the left of the text, we see a small drawing of what I assume to be himself, and it's a pity they didn't keep more of these. John spent much of his time writing or drawing. His writing was characterised by the staff as incomprehensible doggerel, which suggests a lack of understanding on their part. However, on another occasion, they wrote of his poetic efforts. His life in the asylum was dominated by his psychiatric symptoms, of which seeing and hearing angels predominated. It's difficult to know whether they comforted or tormented him. Perhaps it was both. Writing about them was almost certainly therapeutic. The asylum had few resources to treat his troubled mind, but they did keep him physically well. Here is a chart from when he had a fever that documents his temperature and pulse. The staff cared for him and kept him safe. As the years passed, John seems to have improved, or at least calmed down, as there are fewer mentions of him as being excited. By 1888, he was reported as working usefully in the tailor's and later the shoemaker's shop. He attended the church service at the chapel, which now houses the Glenside Museum, and he went to the weekly dance. This drawing depicts a similar event at the Wells Asylum. John's religion seems to have had an effect on the nature of his symptoms, and being labelled as insane may have been particularly difficult for a Methodist. Certainly John Wesley thought that the mental disorder was a form of psychic struggle in which God and the devil battled for the psychosomatic control of the subject. John certainly saw his own problems in a similar fashion. His visions often included both the devil and his omnipresent angels. An excerpt from his notes has him as pointing to his head and saying,
"There is a devil."
John's story is not a happy one. His delusions wrecked his home life and made his stay in the institution much more difficult. He made no friends and was suspicious of the staff. He once threatened to attack the medical superintendent for not discharging him. The institution did not cure him, but if he had been discharged, the effect may well have been disastrous. He would almost certainly not have lived to the age of 72. The title of the film describes John as a hero. This may seem far-fetched, but what he did was try and make people understand his experiences. This was not an easy thing to do, and it made him open to ridicule. His contemporaries mostly did not understand him, but the fact that some of his writings were kept by the asylum shows they thought they were of value. Thus we have evidence which gives us insight into the experiences of both John and other people with similar symptoms. We leave you with a poem he wrote, which may seem strange, but is very atmospheric and appears to be a plea to the doctors to try and understand what he perceives.
"The doctor, what in eyeball, move from sight to see a man fall? What in eye do move from vision, when on the ground the form it threw? Do the colours move from whiteness, when we see an angel's brightness? Do the white mould up the man, that before the sight do stand? We see a man form on the ground, we see a man form and tumble down. We see him form with foot and leg, a head on top of old hat peg."
Once past 70, John's physical condition deteriorated, in part due to his chronic Bright's disease. He died on the 31st of July 1912. I believe that his evocative descriptions tell us more about what it was like to have a very serious mental condition than the usual accounts written by the doctors. This is a legacy to be proud of.